Hello again, 102. In this video, we will explain the Watergate scandal and its political significance, and dirty tricks were going on all through the Nixon administration. Even though in the 72 election, he won the greatest victory of any Republican presidential candidate in history, capturing 520 electoral votes to only 17 for George McGovern. The popular vote was equally decisive, 46 million to 28 million. A proportion of the total vote that was second only to Johnson's victory over Goldwater. The only downside to Nixon's triumph was that Democrats maintained control of Congress. However, Nixon remained a chronically insecure person. During the campaign, George McGovern had complained about the numerous dirty tricks orchestrated by members of the Nixon administration. Nixon, it turned out, had ordered illegal wiretaps on his opponents, as well as his own aides, to try to convince the Internal Revenue Service to intimidate Democrats, and he told his chief of staff, H.R. Bob Haldeman, to break into the safe at the Brookings Institution, a Washington research center with Democratic ties, and that goes back to the previous video. They were involved in the publication of the Pentagon Papers and the formulation of them. The Watergate break-in will be the end of the Nixon presidency. George McGovern expressed great concern over the incident on June 17, 1972, when Washington, D.C. police caught 5 burglars breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the exclusive Watergate Hotel apartment office complex. The burglars were all former CIA agents, 4 of whom were Miami-based Cuban exiles. The other, James W. McCord, was the Nixon campaign's security director. The police also arrested 2 other men, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, who were directing the break-in from a hotel across the street. The police found wads of $100 bills on the burglars. At the time, McGovern's complaints about the bungled Watergate break-in seemed like sour grapes from a candidate running far behind in the polls. The president denied any involvement in this very bizarre incident, but he was lying. In a frantic effort to protect Nixon, his White House aides secretly provided $350,000 in hush money to the jailed burglars, only to learn that they wanted $1 million. Nixon and his aides also discussed using the CIA to derail the Justice Department's investigation of the burglary. White House spokesman lied to journalists and destroyed evidence related to the case. Bob Haldeman wanted the jailed Cubans to take the fall, suggesting that they claimed they acted solely on their own. He also told the FBI to quit investigating the incident, falsely claiming that it involved a super-secret CIA operation. Nixon encouraged such cover-up efforts, stressing that his main concern was to keep the White House out of it. And this is the scandal that exposed the criminality and corruption of the Nixon administration and ultimately led to President Nixon's resignation in 1974. Uncovering the cover-up. CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, is heavily involved in this. That campaign war chest, that's where all that money's coming from. And James W. McCord, the security chief of the Committee to Re-elect the President, that's the acronym, was first in what would be a long line of informers to reveal the systematic efforts of Nixon and his aides to create an imperial presidency above the law. By the time of the Watergate break-in, the money to finance such dirty tricks was being illegally collected through CREEP and controlled by the White House staff. The Watergate cover-up crumbled as various people began to cooperate with prosecutors. One of the burglars, James McCord, then named names in testifying before the Sam Ervin of North Carolina committee. He's a Democrat. His so doing led other White House aides to confess their role. And at the same time, 2 reporters for the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, relentlessly pursued the story, eventually making it a compelling topic of national conversation. All the President's Men by Bob Woodward, and that's eventually a Hollywood movie with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman playing the 2 reporters. Woodward was played by Redford. Hoffman does Bernstein. And the cover-up unraveled further in 1973 when L. Patrick Gray, acting director of the FBI, resigned after confessing that he had destroyed incriminating documents at the behest of the president. And on April the 30th, John Ehrlichman and Haldeman resigned, and they would later serve time in prison, as did Attorney General Richard Kleindienst. He just resigned. A few days later, Nixon nervously assured the public in a television address, "I am not a crook." And then John Dean, the White House legal counsel, whom Nixon had dismissed because of his cooperation with prosecutors, shocked the nation by telling the Irving Committee that there had been a White House cover-up approved by the president. And then, in another shocking disclosure, a White House aide told the Irving Committee that Nixon had installed a secret taping system in the White House and that many of the conversations about the Watergate burglary and cover-up had been recorded. And now the tapes and the Saturday Night Massacre, the beginning of the end. The bombshell news about the recording system in the Oval Office set off a year-long battle for the Nixon tapes. Harvard Law professor Archibald Cox, who Nixon's new Attorney General Elliot Richardson had appointed as special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate case, took the president to court in October 1973 to obtain the tapes. Nixon refused to release the recordings and ordered Cox fired. On October 20th, in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Richardson and his deputy, William Ruckelshaus, resigned rather than follow Nixon's order to fire the special prosecutor. And Solicitor General Robert Bork, to his later chagrin, finally fired Cox. Bork will be denied a seat on the Supreme Court in the late 80s because of his role in the Watergate scandal. And now there's heavy-duty calls for Nixon's impeachment. And Cox's dismissal failed to end Nixon's legal troubles because Leon Jaworski, the Texas lawyer, the new prosecutor, he's also going to take Nixon to court. And by the summer of 1974, Nixon's in full retreat. The Watergate drama transfixed Americans who watched the daily Irving Committee hearings as if they were episodes in a soap opera. This is the culture of scandal, ladies and gentlemen, that we still have today. On July 24, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in United States versus Richard Milhouse Nixon that the president must surrender all the tape recordings, a 9-0 decision. And a few days later, the House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice through the payment of hush money to witnesses and the withholding of evidence, abuse of power through the use of federal agencies to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights, and a defiance of Congress by withholding the tapes. The president, Alexander Haig, who was the National Security Advisor, now Nixon's chief of staff, confided to White House aides that the president was guilty as hell. He then told Nixon, his boss, that he did not see how he could survive this one. And before the House of Representatives could meet to vote on impeachment, Nixon grudgingly handed over the complete set of White House tapes. The drama continued, however, when investigators learned that segments of several recordings were missing, including 18 minutes of key conversations in June 1972, during which Nixon first mentioned the Watergate burglary. The president's loyal secretary took the blame for the erasure, claiming that she had accidentally pushed the wrong button, but technical experts later concluded that the missing segments had in fact been intentionally deleted. The other White House tape recordings, however, provided more than enough evidence of Nixon's involvement in the cover-up. The incriminating tape recordings led Republican leaders to urge Nixon to quit rather than face an impeachment trial in the Senate controlled by the Democrats. And on August 9, 1974, the embattled president did just that. He resigned from office, the only president ever to do so. And there goes Tricky Dick, leaving the White House on August 9, 1974. And this results, ladies and gentlemen, in an unelected president. The vice president at the time of Nixon's resignation was Gerald Ford, a congenial former House Minority Leader and All-American football player for national champion Michigan Wolverines in the mid-30s, whom Nixon had appointed to succeed Spiro Agnew, who had been forced to resign when it was disclosed that he had been taking bribes as the governor of Maryland. And this is the 25th Amendment in action. And on August 9th, 1974, and Ford had been approved by the House and Senate when he was appointed. He's a very well-liked man. And he's approved on August the 9th, and he's the first politically appointed chief executive, the only person in history to serve as both vice president and president without having been elected to those offices. And President Ford reassured the nation that our long nightmare is over. But only a month after taking office on September the 8th, 1974, Ford reopened the wounds of Watergate by issuing a full, free, absolute pardon to Richard Nixon for any federal crimes he may have committed. And that was a huge error by Ford. That was a very, very unpopular move. His opinion poll numbers dropped significantly, and there's already these problems of rising rates of unemployment and inflation in 1974 that Keynesian economics couldn't explain. This was the phenomenon in the 70s of stagflation. It wasn't supposed to work this way. When there's high unemployment, prices historically had dropped. But in the 70s, they were rising, ladies and gentlemen, at the same time, because we're paying for that $158 billion spent in Vietnam and the Great Society War on Poverty programs. And this ends chapter 28 on the rebellion and reaction in the 60s and 70s.